On the morning of February 3, 1891, the Miller family abandoned their homestead in the middle of winter, leaving behind firewood, food stores, and a cabin that had sheltered them through 6 previous winters without incident. Now, when neighbors asked why they had fled in conditions that made travel dangerous, Henry Miller said only that the cold had learned where they lived, that it had been watching them through the walls, and that staying another night would have meant letting it finish what it had been slowly preparing to do. He could not explain what he meant by these statements, could not articulate what the cold watching entailed, but the fear in his voice and the exhaustion in his family's faces suggested they had experienced something during that winter that made abandoning everything they owned seem preferable to spending one more night in the cabin where the cold had somehow become aware of their presence. Welcome to this journey through one of the most psychologically disturbing winters ever endured in the Ozark Valley. In the years when cold was understood as simple physics, as the absence of heat, as temperature measured in degrees, as something that could kill through exposure, but that possessed no awareness and no intent beyond the mechanical processes of thermal energy transfer, there lived a family who came to believe that the cold in their cabin was not merely atmospheric condition, but something that observed them, that learned their routines and their vulnerabilities, that waited with what felt like patience for opportunities to reach them when they were most defenseless. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the line between environmental hardship and psychological deterioration, between cold as physical phenomenon and cold as presence. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we enter that cabin and try to understand what made a family believe the cold was watching them, consider what extreme cold does to human psychology and why the sensation of being observed during prolonged isolation is one of the most commonly reported psychological responses to environmental stress. Cold affects the brain, reduces blood flow to cognitive centers, creates sensory distortions, produces the kind of hypervigilance that makes people interpret random sounds or sensations as meaningful patterns, as evidence of threat or of intention where only physics exists. Isolation amplifies these effects, creating conditions where the absence of external social feedback makes internal experiences, however distorted, seem real and valid because there are no contrary perspectives to provide correction or reassurance. The sensation of being watched is particularly common during extreme stress or isolation because it represents the brain's attempt to make sense of environmental signals that seem threatening, but that have no clear source. When people feel cold draft that has no obvious origin, when they hear sounds that seem to follow patterns but that cannot be attributed to identifiable causes, when they experience the kind of sustained physical discomfort that extreme cold creates, the mind sometimes resolves these inputs into the narrative of intentional observation, the sense that something is paying attention, learning patterns, waiting for vulnerability. This interpretation is almost always false, a psychological artifact rather than accurate perception of external reality. But from inside the experience, it can feel absolutely true, can create fear that is as real as any fear created by actual threat. The Miller family, Henry and Elizabeth, both 36 years old, and their 3 children, Alice aged 13, Thomas aged 10, and Margaret aged 7, had lived on their homestead in a narrow valley approximately 7 miles north of what would eventually become Willow Springs, Missouri, since 1885. They had survived 6 winters there without unusual difficulty, had adapted to the isolation that the location created, and had developed the routines and the skills that frontier winter survival required. They were considered by neighbors to be a capable family who managed their property well and who showed no signs of the psychological fragility that made some people unsuited for the isolation and hardship that frontier life entailed. The winter of 1890-1891 began normally. Snow fell in December, temperatures dropped to typical winter levels, and the Miller family settled into the routines that previous winters had established. Maintaining fire, managing food stores, keeping children occupied during the long confinement, enduring the cold and the isolation until spring would allow resumed contact with neighbors and resumed work on the land. Nothing about the early winter suggested that this season would be different from the previous 6, that the cold they were experiencing would become something other than what cold had always been. But in mid-January, Henry began to mention to Elizabeth that something felt wrong in the cabin, that the cold seemed different than it had in previous winters, that there was a quality to it that made him uncomfortable in ways he could not clearly articulate. Elizabeth initially dismissed these comments as the normal complaints that long winters created, the kind of irritability and vague dissatisfaction that confinement produced in everyone, and that usually resolved once weather moderated and movement outside became possible again. But Henry's comments became more specific. He said the cold seemed to move through the cabin in patterns that were not consistent with normal air circulation, that it seemed to linger in certain locations as if it were waiting there, that when he walked through particularly cold areas, he had the sensation of passing through something rather than merely entering colder air. Elizabeth tried to explain these sensations as the normal behavior of cold air in a cabin with imperfect insulation, as drafts that entered through gaps in walls or around windows, and that created the temperature variations Henry was noticing. But Henry insisted that what he was experiencing was different from normal drafts, that the cold was behaving in ways that seemed intentional rather than mechanical. By late January, other family members were reporting similar sensations. Elizabeth began to notice that certain areas of the cabin were consistently colder than others in ways that did not correspond to where drafts should logically enter, that the cold in these areas seemed more intense than temperature alone would explain, that there was a quality to the cold that made it feel actively present, rather than merely absent of warmth. The children reported feeling watched when they moved through the cabin, particularly at night, particularly when moving between the main room where the fire burned and the sleeping areas where cold was most pronounced. Henry attempted to address the problem through practical means. He checked the cabin's walls for gaps that might be allowing unusual drafts, resealed areas where chinking had deteriorated, added insulation where he could, and ensured that the stove was burning efficiently to provide maximum warmth. But these efforts did not change the sensations the family was experiencing, did not make the cold feel less present or less aware, and if anything seemed to make the problem worse, as if the cold recognized their attempts to exclude it and was responding by finding new ways to make its presence felt. The children became increasingly reluctant to move away from the fire, began to resist going to the sleeping areas even when exhaustion made sleep necessary, and started to display signs of anxiety that Elizabeth recognized as beyond the normal stress of winter confinement. Alice, the oldest, began to insist that the cold in the sleeping area was waiting for them, that it knew when they were coming, and that it positioned itself to intercept them. Thomas reported waking in the night feeling intensely cold in specific spots on his body, his face, his hands, as if the cold was focusing on those areas deliberately, rather than affecting him uniformly. Margaret, the youngest, began having nightmares about being touched by something cold that wanted to pull heat from her body. Elizabeth tried to maintain rationality, tried to explain to the children that cold was physics rather than entity, that their sensations were the result of their minds interpreting uncomfortable physical experiences as intentional when nothing was actually observing them or targeting them. But even as she provided these explanations, Elizabeth was experiencing sensations that contradicted her rational framework, was feeling the cold in ways that seemed to confirm what the children were reporting, and was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain the distinction between what she knew intellectually about temperature and what she was experiencing sensorially about the cold in the cabin. By early February, the family's daily routines had been altered by their growing fear of the cold. They spent as much time as possible near the fire, delaying trips to the sleeping areas until exhaustion made remaining awake impossible. They moved through the cabin quickly when movement was necessary, as if trying to pass through cold areas before the cold could fully register their presence. They began sleeping in shifts, with one parent always awake and near the fire, as if maintaining constant vigilance would somehow protect against what felt like the cold's watchful attention. Henry became convinced that the cold was learning their patterns, that it was observing when they slept and when they moved and when they were most vulnerable to its effects, and that it was using this knowledge to position itself where it would have maximum impact. He described instances where he would wake in the night and immediately feel intense cold on his face, as if the cold had been waiting above him for him to regain consciousness, as if it wanted him to be aware of its presence, rather than merely affecting him while he slept unaware. He began to speak about the cold as if it were an entity, referring to it, rather than using impersonal terms like the temperature, and attributing to it characteristics like patience and intelligence and intentionality that no physical phenomenon should possess. Elizabeth tried to counter Henry's increasingly disturbed interpretations, tried to maintain perspective that what they were experiencing was psychological response to extreme isolation and cold, rather than actual observation by something that should not be capable of observation. But she was finding it harder to maintain this perspective when her own experiences seemed to support Henry's interpretations, when she too felt the sensation of being watched, when she too experienced the cold as something that seemed aware of her presence, and that seemed to respond to her movements and her vulnerabilities in ways that random physical phenomena should not respond. The crisis came on the night of February the 2nd. The family had gone to sleep in their usual pattern, Henry and Elizabeth in the sleeping area with the children, fire burning in the main room to provide some ambient heat, blankets piled on to protect against the cold that was always more intense at night. Henry woke sometime in the early morning hours. He could not determine exact time in the darkness, with the sensation that something was wrong, that the cold in the sleeping area had intensified beyond normal nighttime levels, and that there was a presence in the darkness that was focused on the family in ways that felt predatory rather than environmental. He lay still, trying to identify what had woken him, and became aware that the cold was not uniform throughout the sleeping area, but was concentrated in specific locations. Above where he lay, above where Elizabeth lay beside him, above where each of the children slept. The cold in these locations felt different from the ambient cold, felt focused and intense, and as if it were pressing down on each sleeping person individually, as if it were trying to find ways through the blankets and through the clothing to reach skin directly and to extract heat with an efficiency that normal cold air movement should not possess. Henry woke Elizabeth, speaking quietly so as not to alarm the children, telling her that something was wrong, that the cold was behaving in ways that were not natural, that they needed to move to the main room where the fire was burning. Elizabeth, still half asleep, began to argue that they were fine, that moving would wake the children unnecessarily. But as she became more alert, she began to feel what Henry was describing, the sense that the cold was concentrated above them, that it was pressing down with what felt like weight rather than merely existing as cooler air, and that there was an intentionality to its positioning that made remaining in the sleeping area feel dangerous in ways that transcended normal cold exposure risk. They woke the children and moved to the main room, wrapping in blankets and positioning themselves near the fire. The children were frightened by the urgency of the move, by the fear they could see in their parents' faces, and the family huddled together near the warmth, trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant about whether they could safely remain in the cabin. Henry described his conviction that the cold had been preparing to do something during the night, that it had been positioning itself above each sleeping family member as if it were learning how to extract heat more efficiently, as if it were practicing or preparing for some final action that it had not yet completed, but that it was working toward. Elizabeth, despite her desire to maintain rational explanation, found that she could not completely dismiss Henry's interpretation, could not convincingly argue that what they had experienced was merely normal cold, when her own sensations had included the feeling of weight and focus and intentionality that physics alone should not create. As dawn approached and weak gray light began to penetrate the cabin, the family made the decision that they could not remain another night in the cabin, where the cold seemed to have become something other than environmental condition, where sleep felt like vulnerability that something was waiting to exploit, where the distinction between physical phenomenon and malevolent attention had become so blurred that continuing to stay felt like accepting risk that no frontier hardship required them to accept. They gathered what they could carry, clothing, some food, minimal supplies, and left the cabin mid-morning on February 3rd, traveling through snow and cold that should have made the journey dangerous, but that felt less threatening than remaining in the cabin where the cold had been watching them. They reached the Patterson homestead, their nearest neighbors approximately 4 miles distant. By late afternoon, exhausted and cold, but alive, and away from whatever had been happening in the cabin they had fled. Frank Patterson listened to Henry Miller's account with the mix of concern and skepticism that the story warranted. He knew the Millers as stable people, knew that Henry was not given to flights of imagination or to the kind of psychological breakdown that isolation could create in people of weaker disposition. But the story Henry was telling, about cold that watched, that learned patterns, that positioned itself above sleeping people as if preparing to do something that transcended normal thermal effect, was not a story that made sense within any framework Patterson understood about how weather and cold behaved. Patterson questioned Henry carefully, trying to determine whether there might be some physical explanation for what the family had experienced. Could there have been gas seepage into the cabin that created the sensations of pressure and of presence? Could some structural problem with the cabin's construction created air circulation patterns that produced the focused cold spots Henry described? Could the family have been experiencing carbon monoxide effects from the stove that created hallucinations or distorted perceptions? Henry acknowledged these possibilities, but insisted that what the family had experienced was not explicable through conventional mechanisms, that the cold had behaved in ways that suggested awareness and intention, and that while he understood how his account sounded, like the ravings of someone whose mind had been broken by isolation and hardship, he knew what he and his family had felt, and he knew that returning to the cabin would be accepting risk that he was not willing to accept, regardless of what rational explanation might be proposed for their experiences. Patterson offered to visit the Miller cabin, to examine it for structural problems or for environmental factors that might explain what the family had experienced, and to provide independent assessment of whether the cabin was safe or whether there were genuine hazards that justified the Millers' abandonment of their property. Henry agreed to this investigation, but warned Patterson that whatever was happening in the cabin might not be apparent to someone who was only there briefly, that the cold's behavior, if behavior was the right word, had developed gradually over weeks, and that short-term observation might not reveal what extended habitation had made clear to the Miller family. Patterson visited the Miller cabin on February 5th, traveling the 7 miles from his homestead to the narrow valley where the Millers had lived. He found the cabin as described. Fire out for 2 days. Interior cold, but not extraordinary, given the absence of heat and the winter conditions. Supplies still present, indicating that abandonment had been precipitous rather than planned. Patterson spent several hours in the cabin, examining walls for gaps, checking the stove for problems, trying to identify any physical characteristics that might explain the Millers' experience. He found nothing obviously wrong. The cabin was solidly built. The stove was functional. There were normal drafts where gaps existed around windows and doors, but nothing that seemed unusual or that would create the focused cold spots Henry had described. Patterson did note that certain areas of the cabin felt colder than others, in ways that were not immediately explicable by proximity to walls or windows. But he attributed this to normal air circulation patterns and to the absence of fire for 2 days that had allowed cold to settle into the structure in ways that might not occur when the cabin was actively heated. What Patterson did experience, though he would later struggle to articulate it clearly, was a sensation of discomfort in the cabin that went beyond mere cold, a feeling that the space was somehow wrong in ways that he could not identify through any specific observation, but that created in him a desire to leave, to return to his own homestead, to not spend night in the structure, even though it would have been more efficient to stay overnight, rather than making the 7-mile return journey in late afternoon. He attributed this sensation to suggestibility, to the knowledge of the Millers' story affecting his perception, but he acknowledged privately that the cabin felt different from other empty cabins he had visited, felt as though something in it was paying attention to his presence in ways that made remaining there feel inadvisable, even if no rational explanation supported that feeling. Patterson reported to Henry Miller that he had found no physical problems with the cabin that would justify abandonment, but he also acknowledged that he understood why the family had felt they needed to leave, that there was something about the space that created discomfort beyond what empty cold structure should create, and that while he could not confirm that the cold was watching or learning or doing anything beyond existing as normal meteorological phenomenon, he also could not dismiss the Millers' experience as simple delusion or psychological breakdown. The Miller family did not return to their cabin. They spent the remainder of winter with various neighbors and with relatives who lived in more settled areas, and in the spring they relocated permanently to a different region, establishing a new homestead in a location that was less isolated and where the cabin, when they built it, did not create in them the sensations of being observed that their previous home had produced. The abandoned cabin in the narrow valley remained empty, was avoided by neighbors who knew the story and who felt that there was something wrong with the structure, even if wrong could not be precisely defined or documented. Over subsequent winters, occasional hunters or travelers who took shelter in the abandoned Miller cabin reported experiences similar to what the Miller family had described. Sensations of being watched, feelings of cold that seemed focused and intentional, impressions that the cold in the cabin was aware of their presence and was responding to their movements and their vulnerabilities in ways that normal cold should not respond. These reports were typically dismissed as suggestion, as people interpreting normal cold through the lens of the story they had heard. But the consistency of the reports and the fact that they came from people who had different levels of knowledge about the Millers' experience suggested that something about the cabin or its location created experiences that were remarkably consistent across multiple observers. Modern attempts to explain what the Miller family experienced focus on several possible mechanisms. The psychological effects of extreme isolation and cold are well documented and include sensory distortions, hypervigilance, and the interpretation of random environmental stimuli as meaningful patterns. The narrow valley location might have created unusual air circulation that produced cold spots and drafts that felt focused rather than random. Infrasound, low-frequency vibrations that humans cannot consciously hear, but that can create feelings of unease and of presence, might have been generated by wind patterns interacting with the valley's topography, creating the sensation of being watched without any actual observation occurring. But these explanations, while plausible, require accepting that the Miller family and subsequent visitors to the cabin all experienced similar psychological or perceptual distortions, that the cabin's location created consistent infrasound or air circulation effects that multiple people interpreted in similar ways, and that the sense of cold, as aware and intentional, was artifact of human perception rather than any actual property of the environment. These explanations are almost certainly correct. Cold does not watch, does not learn, does not position itself with intention. But from inside the experience, from the perspective of people living in extreme isolation with cold that seemed to behave in ways that transcended physics, the distinction between psychological artifact and external reality can become impossible to maintain. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark Valley's most psychologically disturbing winters. A family who came to believe the cold was watching them, who experienced sensations of intentional observation and of focused cold that seemed to learn their patterns and to wait for vulnerability, and who fled their cabin in the middle of winter because staying felt more dangerous than traveling through conditions that should have made travel the greater risk. The Miller family learned the cold was watching them stands as a reminder that extreme isolation and extreme cold affect not just bodies but minds, that the distinction between environmental physics and environmental presence can break down when human perception is stressed beyond normal limits, and that sometimes what we experience feels absolutely true, even when what we know about physics and psychology tells us that truth is artifact rather than reality, that the cold we fear is the cold our minds create, rather than the cold that actually exists, and that the watching we sense is our own hypervigilance reflected back at us, rather than any actual observation by phenomenon that should possess no awareness. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where cold becomes presence and where physical discomfort becomes psychological terror, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between environmental stress and perceptual distortion, between what is real and what feels real, when isolation and hardship push human minds beyond their normal capacity. Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts on whether the Miller family experienced something real or something their minds created, on where the line falls between justified fear and psychological breakdown, on what it means when cold feels like it's watching. And if this story resonated with you, a like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate stories that remind us that our minds can betray us when stressed, that perception does not always reflect reality, and that the most frightening presence might be the one we create ourselves when isolation and cold combine to make environmental physics feel like malevolent attention. Until our next journey into territories where environment becomes entity and where cold seems conscious when consciousness should be impossible, remember that somewhere in an Ozark Valley there sits an abandoned cabin where multiple people have reported feeling watched by the cold, where the distinction between thermal effect and intentional presence has become so blurred that experienced frontiersmen fled rather than spending another night in shelter that should have been protection, but that felt like trap, and where the question persists, was the cold really watching them, or were they watching themselves watch the cold until their own vigilance became the threat they feared?